Welcome to Corpus Christi College. It's lovely to see you all. This should be a good day, few in number, but that doesn't matter at all. We have two excellent speakers, Roger Pooley here, coming from Keele University, and Val Cunningham, who is a retired member of this college, both English specialists. And it should be a very interesting day. I hope you really enjoy it. Don't be shy about asking questions and making comments, because this will help to enrich the day for all of us. Can you hear me? Just. I haven't got a very large voice, but just be aware of it.
It's my own fault.
No, it's easily done. I'm forgetting things all the time. You can hear now. Good. So, welcome, Roger Pooley.
Well, good morning everyone, and thanks for turning out on such a lovely autumn day. As I think this is more a seminar size than a lecture size, I hope you'll feel able to ask questions as we go along. Also, sort of raise your hand if my voice starts to drop and you need a bit more articulation from me. I'm down for 2 slots. In the first one, I want to explore something of Bunyan's life, which I guess will be familiar to many, but not all. And in particular, what I can call provisionally at least, his spiritual autobiography, or his account of his conversion in Grace Abounding, and how that feeds into the Pilgrim's Progress. But to bear in mind that he was overall the author of some 60 works, some quite substantial, others a couple of pages, and one we'll maybe look at this afternoon, which is 1 page, but it is a picture.
Space bar on it.
Right, so I'm a Macintosh addict and having to remember which button to press for Windows. Very nice to have the Vicar of Elstow here, and so at least we can say right at the beginning. The village, I suppose, is on the edge of Bedford now, but was separate in the 17th century. And only about a bit more than 100 years ago, the cottage, which is supposed to be where Bunyan's family lived, was demolished. But you can still visit the Moot Hall, and in particular the area where playing with his friends at a game of cat, which is, as far as we can tell, a sort of skittles and catching game. He heard the voice of God asking him to leave his sins. It's important too to remember that he went for some kind of schooling, not university or anything like that. And as he developed as a Christian, he continued, as many Puritans, I'll talk about Puritan in a moment, disliked humane learning, which is a way of saying that they regard the spiritual instruction from the Bible as being superior to the largely classics-based teaching that went on in grammar schools and universities in that time. And although his family economically were on the downward track as far as we can tell, certainly they were not really people of property anymore, and Bunyan's father got his living by being a travelling tinker. A tinker is someone who tinkers, but obviously, but is essentially a travelling metal worker. Now, if you go to the Bunyan Museum in Bedford, how many of you have been here apart from us two? Worth a trip. They've really jazzed it up in recent years. And you can still see, I'm not sure whether you're allowed to lift it anymore, Bunyan's anvil. And Bunyan, the anvil would stand, I suppose, about so high with quite a large spike underneath. And he would hammer that into the ground in order to do what you need to do with metal. And of course, as soon as you realise the weight of this solid lump of iron, you'll see why Bunyan reached for the notion of sin as a burden in his work in Pilgrim's Progress. The other significant thing to notice is that, still quite young, he was mustered into the parliamentary army, stationed at the garrison at Newport Pagnell, which is not that far from Bedford. Not out of any great conviction, I think, of the rightness of the revolutionary side, but he was short of money, he needed the money, and I think this attaches to some of the suspicion that he was held in by the authorities in the 1650s and in particular in the 1660s when he was put into prison. And he did have some experience of battle. There's just a hint in Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners that he was at a siege, possibly the siege of Chester. There's no great evidence for that. And that somebody had just taken his place in the besieging part of the battle, and then was immediately hit and killed by a musket shot. So he felt as though he was, looking back on it, rescued as a result. And one of the great works of Bunyan, which we're not saying very much at all about today, is the Holy War, which was his second great allegory, in which he talks about the man's soul, the city, in an allegorical way, and does seem to have a certain relish for the military metaphors in there. Here's Robert White's pencil portrait. White drew and engraved a very large number of assorted nonconformist divines in the 60s and 70s in particular, and most of the engraved versions of Bunyan's Head and Shoulders that appear seem to be derived from this. A sense probably of quite a stocky, even muscular man, certainly a very strong man. If you're in prison for 12 years in the 17th century and you survive for what, another 16, you're fairly strong anyway. But there is that sense of a burly physical presence to go with the spiritual one. So this is what happened on the field in Elstow. I was in the midst of a game at cat, and having struck it one blow from the hole, just think of golf as a kind of alternative but rather more violent. Just as I was about to strike it the second time, a voice did suddenly dart from heaven into my soul, which said, "Wilt thou leave thy sins and go to heaven, or have thy sins and go to hell?" At this I was put into an exceeding maze, wherefore, leaving my cat upon the ground, I looked up to heaven, and was as if I had with the eyes of my understanding seen the Lord Jesus looking down upon me as being very hotly displeased with me. Something I'm going to sort of edge towards rather more in the second talk is the question of fearfulness. One of the keys, I think, to understanding Bunyan is to think about the role of fear in his religion, in his conversion, and the importance of what he would label later godly fear. It's at this point that I'm just going to ask you a question, and you don't have to answer it, but a show of hands might be good. When did you last hear a sermon or a talk which advised you that fear was a good thing for a Christian? Yeah, there's one person. That's an advance on what I thought. It's certainly true of my own coming to personal faith in a little Methodist church in Watford, that many Sunday evenings, this group of lads I was sitting with, most of whom I still see, we were effectively being bushwhacked into fearing for the state of our own souls. I think that's still worth thinking about, but I think that's key to a lot of what you might call Bunyan's theological psychology. And so, many years later, of course, Bunyan publishes, or what shall we call it, a conversion account, with the title alluding, of course, to St. Paul's notion of himself as the chief of sinners. Grace abounding to the chief of sinners. For those of you who are not familiar with 17th century title pages, this is standard stuff. You put on your title page. You put on your title page what a modern publisher would put on the inside leaf or the back of it or something like that. It's the advert, because by and large books were not sold ready bound, and so on the kind of booksellers market that you'd see outside St. Paul's Cathedral, for example, there would be these things just laid out before you, and everything has to come from the title page. But it's still interesting because of the way in which he's not putting himself down, but making a public display of humility, of the exceeding mercy of God in Christ to his poor servant, John Bunyan, wherein is particularly showed the manner of his conversion, his fight and trouble for sin, his dreadful temptations, also how he despaired of God's mercy, and how the Lord at length, through Christ, did deliver him from all the guile and terror that lay upon him. Sorry about this whistle. And also there's a kind of appendix, a brief relation of his call to the work of the ministry, of his temptations, and also what he met with in prison. Interesting that that's the past tense, because it comes out in 1666, which is more or less in the middle of Bunyan's time in prison. He was imprisoned in 1660 for illegal preaching, and let's try another angle. And on top of that, although he got out on parole, I don't think imprisonment means quite the same thing in the 17th century in a county town like Bedford. He would be let out on what we now call parole at various times, but effectively he stayed there and was occasionally given the opportunity to be let out as long as he promised not to preach again. The interesting thing about that is not just that he never promised it, but that his family would, and particularly his extraordinarily courageous wife, would occasionally appear before the magistrates to plead his case. We should think of Bunyan's conversion, although that's the word he uses, as something that happened in one go, although there was quite dramatic moments. that his first attempt to please God was what many Puritans and I guess evangelicals afterwards would call legal righteousness. In other words, he would try to please God by stopping the worst of his sins, swearing in particular, appears to have been one. And he got very fascinated with church going. And so giving up is part of what he calls his outward reformation, which isn't good enough. All this while I did not know Jesus Christ. Now he was quite fond of bell ringing, and as the vicar will tell you, it's a separate tower in Elstow Church. And part of Bunyan's process of, if you like, self-improvement is to, as it were, make attempts to, I think, almost, fall in love with the church. He was very interested in the level of, I suppose, almost ceremony with the local priest. And there was one moment where, this is paragraph 33, if I can just track it down, that he used to like bell ringing. I take much delight in ringing, but my conscience began to be tender. Tender conscience is a classic Puritan moment in the stage of conversion. I thought that such a practice was but vain, and therefore forced myself to leave it, yet my mind hankered, wherefore I should go to the steeple house and look on. Quakers as well as Puritans tended to call churches steeple houses, as a way of saying it isn't really a holy place at all, it's just got a steeple on it. Now, but I thought this did not become religion neither. Yes, I forced myself and would look on still. So he didn't carry on bell ringing, but he enjoyed the sound and watched them doing it. You can see how it might be quite interesting to watch all the change things. Then I chose to stand under a main beam that lay overthwart the steeple from side to side, thinking that there I might stand sure. So, a nice beam should keep you from any falling. And then I thought, should the bell fall with a swing, it might first hit the wall and then bounce back effectively and get him anyway. It's at this point, I think, that a lot of writers about Bunyan over the years have been tempted into psychological diagnosis. Even the great Richard Greaves, whose Glimpses of Glory is the book on Bunyan's life and times and works, I think, decides that really he was suffering from depression a lot of times, and others have given alternatives. But interestingly, it's not the ecclesiastics that interest him and that really speak to him. It's the poor women of Bedford, again from Grace Abounding. They were just sitting there in the sun. They talked how God visited their souls with his love in the Lord Jesus, and with what words and promises they had been refreshed, comforted, and supported against the temptations of the devil. And at that point, he's starting to think that there is something in personal religion which is quite different from ecclesiastical. And despite that, he joins a church. The Bedford Separatist Church at this stage was pastored by John Gifford, who interestingly was a former Cavalier captain. This is a rather crude summary of its nature. It was congregational in organisation, as Bunyan meeting in Bedford still is. That is, that it's not part of any hierarchy as perhaps the Presbyterians would be. And it was Anabaptist in practice, which meant that they recognised as modern Baptists do, that if you make a statement of faith on your own, then you could be baptised. And as far as we know, Bunyan was baptised in the River Ouse, which is not a terribly attractive river, but there is plenty of it. And they were Anglican only in that they met in the building, St Paul's Church in Bedford. He was aware already of larger theological movements. In the course of his very agonised progress towards faith, he reads Luther's commentary on Galatians, which is not a short book, 300, 400 pages, something like that, but it is essentially about salvation by faith, and it seems as most fit for a wounded conscience. So you can see how it's serious, not just in terms of psychological agony, if you like, but also he's reading hard in the Bible and an ancient commentary. It's probably an Elizabethan translation of Luther on Galatians. And so eventually he comes to a certain kind of settled faith. But let me move on to the Pilgrim's Progress, and to begin at the beginning, not with the very interesting author's apology in verse, but with the first paragraph. As I walked through the wilderness of this world, I lighted on a certain place where was a den, and I laid me down in that place to sleep, and as I slept I dreamed a dream. I dreamed, and behold, I saw a man clothed with rags, standing in a certain place, with his face from his own house, a book in his hand, and a great burden upon his back. I looked and saw him open the book and read therein, and as he read, he wept and trembled, and not being able longer to contain, he brake out with a lamentable cry, saying, "What shall I do?" If you've got a copy of The Pilgrim's Progress, it doesn't have to be mine. Bob Owen's is a better edition, though I think my introduction is better. You'll notice that there are a lot of marginal notes in the Bible. And one of my first undergraduate students on Bunyan actually read the book looking up every biblical reference as he went, and said it made so much more sense. So it may be hard, but it's worth it, because you'll see how steeped he is in the Bible, and in a particular practice of reading the Bible as well. And I guess Val will say more about this later on. The extent, for example, in which he used concordance as well as sort of reading the Bible for its stories. And here we are in the story of Graceless who becomes Christian on the road in the first part of the Pilgrim's Progress. And what's interesting, I think, is the mixture of reliable companions, false companions, and oppositions. And I'll talk about the oppositions. Now, when you think of a character called Giant Despair, on the one hand you can see how terrible despair is as far as Bunyan's concerned, and he regarded it as his most central temptation. And yet at the same time, he's a giant, and in part 2, where Christiana and Mercy go on their pilgrimage, he becomes something of a pantomime giant, particularly his wife Diffidence. I just kind of imagine Diffidence as being a slightly bored wife of a giant, saying, you know, what should we do with him? Oh, just beat them up again, seems to be her response. There is a kind of black humour that runs through Pilgrim's Progress. And there are lots of external threats comparable with the magistrates who put Bunyan and kept Bunyan in prison for 12 years. And there's, I think, a very attractive and potent mixture of humour and terror in the way in which these oppositions come and go. That he's got something of the, the imaginative genius to see that, sometimes people's opposition to pilgrims on the path to faith are actually really quite amusing. My favourite is Bunyan's, Bunyan's is someone who's always trying to find the wrong way round of doing things. And he said, "Oh, my father was a waterman, looking one way and rowing the other. And to tell the truth, I got most of my money the same way." The hypocrites are particular targets for Bunyan's humour. Vanity Fair, which is a mixture of humour and threat, and an example of the way in which he uses the Bible to, as it were, get a phrase or an image, and then he expands it in his imagination. Vanity, all is vanity, Book of Ecclesiastes. No mention of fairs or anything like that. But Vanity Fair is one of those phrases that's entered the Bible. There's still, I think, a magazine called Vanity Fair. There's the Thackeray novel, and that's just the title. He's given that phrase from Ecclesiastes, which has quite a potent literary effect already, and gives it a kind of imaginative life in which everything is for sale. And that's part of his, if you like, sort of prophetic humour. I'll give you a quick example. A fair wherein should be sold all sorts of vanity in the town of vanity. Therefore, at this fair are all such merchandise sold as houses, lands, trades, places, honours, preferment, already corrupt, lusts, pleasures, delights, whores, bawds, wives, husbands, children, masters, servants, lives, blood, bodies, souls, silver, gold, and precious stones, and whatnot. And meanwhile, moreover, at this fair there is at all times to be seen jugglings, cheats, games, and so on. It's a very interesting mixture of what you might call a prophetic attack on the triviality of the kind of obsession with what can be bought and sold, and at the same time a sense of, if you like, social criticism. I don't know that Bunyan can really be held as a social radical, except that he hates privilege when there is no moral justification for it, and he recognises that the commercial imperative is something that corrodes social justice. There's also a whole sort of category of what we might call false friends as well as companions. Eventually he picks up faithful and hopeful, but to begin with he gets a whole series of people who won't really stick with him. And it's not really until he's learnt the meaning of pilgrimage and has lost his burden, which is a sort of signifier of his conversion, to find a reliable companion. The second part, 6 years later, Bunyan's out of prison by then, is about Christiana, Christian's wife, and so it's female, and there's a more collective feel to it as well. though you don't need to be a 21st century feminist to notice that they still need male guidance and protection in figures like Greatheart and Valiant for Truth, who are kind of avatars of Pilgrim, of Christian ministers. And they're very conscious that they're following Christian's way as well. The other thing, we were talking about this last night, that's very strong, particularly towards the end of part 2, is that there's a kind of kindness of looking out for each other, particularly those who are in some ways psychologically frail, who are prone to despair and hurt. And I think that's one of the changes in tone and atmosphere, and perhaps a sign of Bunyan's own spiritual journey, that yes, you need bold figures like Valiant for Truth, but you've also got to look after those tender souls whose faith is real, but whose, if you like, psychological strength is rather limited. And this is a kind of trailer for this afternoon, really. William Empson, who was no great fan of Christianity, I think, in a wonderful poem, this is only a little bit of it, Courage Means Running. Fearful had the root of the matter in him, bringing him things to fear, and he read well that ran. Much afraid, right at the end of the part 2 this is, went over the river singing, though none knew what she sang. And then Empson has this wonderful comment at the end. Usual for a man of Bunyan's courage to respect fear. Right on the bottom, that, I think. Final section, I just want to think a bit about what makes a Christian classic, maybe a spiritual classic. At this point, if I can just awaken you from your slumbers for a moment. No, you've been very attentive so far. Rather than asking you for a quick off-the-cuff definition of a Christian classic or spiritual classic, can you give me an example? Straight off. Pilgrim's Progress is not allowed, obviously. Sorry? So Augustine's Confessions, yeah. Definitely. I mean, would you want to say why? I'm not disputing it for a minute. I suppose it's, I mean, as you can say, it's stood the test of time, but also it's spawned a lot of imitators as well. That it's not just a kind of classic on its own terms, but people have followed that route. And I guess we could
would Julian of Norwich be?
Julian of Norwich, Revelations, yeah, yeah, quite different.
Meister Eckhart.
Okay.
Don't ask me.
Right.
You can do a very good presentation on Meister Eckhart from the side.
Yeah, yeah.
De Trinitate.
Sorry?
De Trinitate by Augustine.
Yeah, yeah, that would be another. It's interesting, that's the first one that doesn't really have what you might call a narrative or a literary aspect to it, but that's okay.
Teresa's autobiography was
Yeah.
She has such an intense love of God.
Yes.
She expresses through charity.
Yeah.
It's so strong.
Yeah. Yeah. Milton.
Paradise Lost.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, that's another example of something that spawns not so much imitations as, bits, probably most people's version of Satan is bound up as much with Milton's version as with, Genesis 1 to 3. Yeah.
Suited.
I was wondering whether C.S. Lewis would make it in at some point. Yeah, Yeah. There are three questions really I want to consider. We're coming more or less to the end, aren't we? First of all, is the Bible a Christian classic? It depends what you mean by a classic. There is one way of saying, well, the Bible is in a special category because it's inspired and regarded as authoritative in a way that others aren't. But at the same time, the Bible is something you study and you reread. I suppose one of the definitions, or that's not the right word maybe, of a classic is that you can reread it. Not just as a sort of comfort blanket, as you might, reread children's stories last thing at night, but as something which offers something different each time. That's why, taking Val's example, before I retired, I reckon I taught Paradise Lost every year for about 20 years, and it always came out different. I mean, my routine might not have been that different, but the students would always pick up something different, and that the multifaceted aspect of it would be important. There is, if you'll forgive, a bit of hardcore theology. David Tracy's discussion in a book called The Analogical Imagination. It's a book to dip into, I think. But he does make a comparison here between the greatest classics, Shakespeare, Dante, nobody's mentioned that yet, Michelangelo, Mozart. In other words, a classic isn't just literary, but it might be artistic in other ways as well. And the phrase that struck me when I was looking at this was, the form is always unsteady, always partly flawed, and yet the work works because the flaws can contribute to the greater effect. And in particular, of a lived existence, I love this phrase, of participation in a reality greater than the self. And that, I think, is part of it. That there might be a kind of disjunction between the sublimity of the subject and the manner in which it's expressed. But at the same time, that sense that when you reread it, you're faced with, if you like, a formal as well as religious greatness. That's probably enough on that, though. Tracy does go more into the way in which the inadequacy of an artistic form to express the whole, as he puts it, God, if you like, is more evident in the religious classic. And the extent to which Bunyan backs out of saying, I can describe this precisely with the visionary endings of both parts. This might be another way of looking at it, but I'll leave it at that for the moment. Do we have some time for questions? Quite a lot of time for questions, possibly. So, where should we start? Should we start from the back and think about, well, let's, this isn't public shaming at all, in terms of who's read The Pilgrim's Progress and when. How many of you read The Pilgrim's Progress before you were, what should we say, 16, 18, something like that?